our slides for you. There we go. Thank you, Parker. So today we're going to be talking about something that's gotten kind of fancy over the past couple of years. We're looking at how a lot of our clients are interested in understanding engaging payers and what they can do in the payer space. And the traditional just kind of have your list of companies to go to and call upon them for account directors has really changed in recent years. And we have been working with several companies to help figure out new ways to bring innovative information to their account teams to start planning out more tailored engagement strategies, and also for evidence generation planning. So once you kind of know who you're going to, the things that are important to them, what types of information are you taking to them? So today we wanted to kind of talk through our approach to this and some of the work we've been doing, and hopefully get your wheels turning too about how you can be a little bit more involved in your payer strategy. I think we all know this little thing called the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and while most of the legislation is focused on the Medicare market, it will have significant effects on the commercial market. So we're just in a space now where we really need to start thinking as an industry very broadly about how everything kind of seeps into everything else. We also have an industry now where providers and payers are all getting blended, and you have all these new integrated networks, and that's just becoming a bigger and bigger trend that we've seen. So given that PBM reform, you name it, all the things going on, there's just a lot that we're going to see changing in the payer landscape in the next few years. Next slide, please. So other than hearing from me today, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Amanda Forys. I'm the managing partner here at Magnolia Market Access. Two of my esteemed colleagues have joined us, Parker Edman and Beni Turner. Parker is the Director of Market Access and Analytics here at Magnolia Market Access, and Beni Turner is the Director of Real World Clinical Insights. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our objective, as I mentioned today, is just to kind of understand the importance of market access segmentation. So we're going to focus and talk about a payer segmentation example today, just because I think that's a really good real-time one to show you all, just given the world right now. But market access segmentation is really more than that. It's not just understanding who your insurers are. It's understanding who your trade associations are that are out there doing the kind of work that you should be a proponent of, or who your competitors are that might be bringing other products to the market and creating a more challenging access strategy for you. Not just who the docs are, who the patients are, the patient interest groups, who are people on the Hill that are thinking about your product or your issues that you should be engaged with. So it's a very comprehensive way of thinking about the ecosystem around you and what to do to eventually bring access to your patients. So we think of it not just payer segmentation, but market access segmentation. And the idea of that is to find the key things that are important to your organization, how they align, and identify the key important things to the market access stakeholders that are out there, and then do some analyses. And we're going to show you some clustering work that we've done here to pick out specific qualities in those different groups, and then identify the best ways to engage with them. So using data, using specific marketing tactics, highlighting key issues. For example, we have a lot of people talking about products on the market right now that are for caregivers, for patients with specific diseases. Do we have ways that employer-sponsored groups are more interested in that because they're thinking maybe a bit broader about a patient, caregiver, and an employee that's taking care of a sick family member, maybe a little bit differently than you might see in the Medicare market, right? So looking at the payer world in that space versus an oncology product for, a cancer that people might get and as they're older and are Medicare is very different. They're all very different strategies that we have to consider. So thinking about, how to break that information out and then how to bring the right information to those people is key. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is we're helping people think about navigating the healthcare landscape is to understand through strategic partnerships, understanding the dynamics of those stakeholders, developing a plan, and then getting tailored value messaging. And I think Parker and Beni will give very good examples of that to you. So I won't talk too long and take their thunder. But the idea here is to figure out, again, who are your partners and who are your frenemies in industry and who are your enemies, right? Who are your competitors? Who do you align with? Potentially, there's associations of a lot of competitors that get together that have very similar interests aligned. And then sometimes you want to do things on your own as a company, right? So identify who you should be working with is to get to your goals in the market access space. Understand all of the different factors that those people are thinking about, developing that plan, and then realizing, and we're just going to, pound this in this whole session here, is it's not a one size fits all approach, right? Every single thing that we do could be different depending on the payer and their audience. Next. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Parker and Beni, and we're going to talk a little bit about payer segmentation as kind of layer one, thinking through the first level of the ecosystem. Parker? I just unmuted you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, apologies for that. I wasn't allowed to unmute myself. So my name is Parker. I'm a director of market access and analytics here at Magnolia. I run a lot of our payer segmentation as well as provider segmentation work here at Magnolia. And so I'm super excited to kind of discuss more about what is segmentation, how it's performed, how do we get these actionable insights to our clients. So to start off, what's the high level of what we do with the payer segmentation? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sit down with our client and really kind of define the strategic imperatives for the engagement. What are the idiosyncrasies with the market that are coming up with the development of a product that may be potential issues that we need to watch out for? Defining these strategic imperatives really allow us to target and mine those key variables and available data for the segmentation differentiation. So what we do is we collect a bunch of different pieces of data, often from the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, from Clarivate in the form of formulary data. We also use our in-house open claims data set to look at prescribing pattern data if we're looking at a provider segmentation. And then any other types of data sets that we need to collect, or oftentimes we'll create specific variables using primary and desktop research. What we then do is we take those variables and we put them through, we segment them. And there are many different ways to segment a market. Oftentimes, the most rudimentary way is really to kind of do 2x2 axes graphs where you kind of look at entities based off of specific variables. What we like to do, especially when it's a very large market or market segment like providers or sometimes payers, depending on how large of a payer group you're looking at, we like to use a k-means clustering model. What this allows us to do, essentially, it sounds fancy, but really what it does is it takes all of that data and helps us parse out the meaningful differentiation between variables and helps us sort them into what we would call clusters. I'll show you a little bit how those clusters work and how they look as an end product. What we will then do is we'll take those clusters, we'll start to bounce ideas off with the client. What are key things that we're seeing from the data? How can we better refine the data? Do we want to tweak a variable in a certain way to elucidate a different result or answer? And then what we do is we kind of combine all of this data into a key trend summary and workbook, something that's very actionable. And then what we'll do is we'll also combine this with other real world types of implementation, like what Beni is going to talk about later. So this is our healthcare stakeholder landscape. There's all these different types of entities and people, and I think it's really important to know that in this new landscape, a payer is not just a payer anymore. A provider is not just a provider. We have payviders. We have payers who also own specialty pharmacies. We have payers who own behavioral health providers and so forth. The landscape is becoming increasingly complicated and increasingly both larger in terms of the number of lives that are being covered, but also smaller in terms of the number of entities as entities kind of consolidate together. This means that it's really important to understand who your stakeholders are and identify those key stakeholders of interest. So who are the people that you should be reaching out to? With limited resources from your field teams or your account representatives, who are those people that are going to be most impactful in helping drive formulary decisions, drive coverage for your patients, and eventually get that product to your patients so that they can use it? So what we do is, like I said, we collect bunches of information on these identified stakeholders, really seeing what pieces of differentiation look like. And just to kind of talk about what those are, we think about, you know, from a payer example, we could talk about using formulary data and looking at the formulary uniformity between payers. Are payers more open in their formulary? Are they more closed in their formulary? Are they they have a higher tendency to prefer one product over the other? Or do they have a tendency to kind of keep a broad base type of limit across all types of products within a class? We're also able to see specific product preferences. So if a client determines that a certain product is going to probably be their highest competitor within the market, we're able to see which payers are preferring those products more and or less. So that is another really important one. Another thing that we can do is really look into ACO and value-based care participation, looking at, you know, are they participating in a specific CMS, ACO, or value-based care plan? Sometimes we can dig deeper and look at if they're participating in any commercial ACOs. Finally, like some of the organizational types of data. So whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, whether they're owning a PBM, whether they own a provider asset or a provider asset owns them. And then finally, you know, how heavy are they in Medicare versus commercial versus Medicaid? And then what we finally do is we take that and we put it through that k-means clustering model, and we really we segment the market. We look at, okay, do payers in segment A have a very specific preference for a certain type of product? Do payers in segment B, are they more nonprofit? Do they have more of a mission-driven bent to them? We're able to do that. We usually like to pick between about 4 to 6 clusters. We find that that's the best way to kind of spread out the market and see that differentiation while not making so many clusters that it's almost impossible to kind of determine and identify and or prioritize certain segments. And this is what it looks like in the end. So this is an example of something that we've done before. And we looked at, you know, this specific class of products, and they had 2 products in particular that they were most interested in terms of looking at and segmenting on. We also looked at their formulary uniformity, like I talked about earlier. And then we also wanted to see the Medicare and Medicaid percentage within the market. And finally, we also looked at provider integration, not-for-profit flag. So we usually try to segment around, you know, 7 to 10 variables here, sometimes 12 if it's really important. But looking at, you know, more than just like 2 or 3, but not looking at everything is really important, because with these clustering models, it's really important to kind of narrow it down and see what are those key variables of differentiation. And then what we can do later is, if we have lots of other data, which we usually do, and we're able to generate lots of other data, like for this one, we were able to also generate like PBM integration flags, as well as product preferences for other non-target products. We're able to also then kind of look at the data there and see how they break out by cluster as well. But these are the only variables that kind of go into that clustering model. And what you'll see here is is we're able to find trends across a cluster and across variables. So for example, with cluster one, you'll see that there's a really high Medicaid percentage. And you're saying, okay, great. So you found your Medicaid payers. What's really interesting about this, though, is that they also have really high formulary uniformity. So this really helps you drive for your Medicaid payers. How are you approaching them from a formulary perspective? What do they look like in terms of their preference for your primary competitors? Another thing that we're able to do, for example, in cluster two is really look at, okay, who does this cluster prefer? And this cluster was named product two prefers because of that high product two preference. But once again, what we're also able to see is that they have a higher Medicare percentage than average. So this is going to really define what you look at in terms of your Medicare preference or your Medicare market as you're going into that market and helping payers make those formulary decisions. Finally, what we're also able to do is take a heat map and look at concentrations of payer stakeholders by key segments. So this was for cluster four within that previous example. And what we're able to see here is that there's high amounts of concentration in certain states for this cluster. What this helps us define and look at is, are there any regional types of idiosyncrasies that we need to account for in our clustering? Is there certain states or regions that are of particular interest for us now because they have really high concentrations in a cluster that we're interested in? So all of these things kind of come together, both the radar charts that I showed previously and this heat map to kind of show where does the market look like. And I think what's most important is that, yeah, we're able to generate all this data. We're also able to help generate strategic insights about particular clusters that a client should go into. But really the most important part that we see is that real world implementation. So how do you take this data workbook, this key trends report, and not just leave it on your shelf? How do you actually put boots on the ground and get like real world implementation from this type of segmentation model? So first, I'll just overview some of the segmentation outcomes that we see, and then I'll turn it over to Beni to talk about how do we, drive that real world implementation. So the first thing that we can do is we can inform and shape approach to tier placement negotiations by payer concerns and preferences. This is one of the key reasons why in that previous cluster we looked at Medicare and Medicaid data, because we wanted to see who are the most budget concerned types of payers and what were their formulary preferences overall. This can, also be in terms of what utilization management policies are in place, or are there other cost containment policies that we need to research? Another thing that we're able to do, and it's highly linked towards the previous one, is, inform intents to influence that formulary decision making through segmenting by payer concerns. So once again, looking at cost savings, but if you actually have a really high commercial cluster, maybe you're focusing more on patient outcomes and satisfaction, quality of life type variables that you can put in front of those payers. The last two on the bottom here, I think are really important from a niche or regional focus. So I'll kind of group them together, but really looking at, can we look at, the percentage of patients who are served by Medicaid or extra help? Can we look at patient outcomes and satisfaction? And then also importantly, are there states that they're servicing, or is the payer heavily located in a region or state where we have a high incidence of a certain disease or especially a chronic disease? I'll turn it over to Beni to kind of talk about, okay, what we've got these segmentation outcomes, but how do we turn them into real world insights?
Yeah, before we switch over to Benny, I just have a quick thing to add as well. And this is something, my background's in more policy and pricing and reimbursement. I've kind of, as over time have moved more into just comprehensive market access. But I look at something like this too, given a lot of people who work in state policy, right? So you've got your trade associations, obviously, that are thinking of what's going on in Washington, D.C., but also that boots on the ground and demonstrations and issues that they need to think about at the state level. So when I look at things like this, I also think on how some of this information and thinking of things drilled more down to that regional level or a state by state level could really help with those types of advocacy efforts too. So this is where I think what Parker's talking about, where Benny's going to go into kind of using this and thinking through the implementation. I think this is where teams can really come together at pharma and think through what are we doing from the market access perspective, but how can we drive that and be, smarter in terms of connecting between our market access and our policy team, or our market access and our economics team. So I just find these, as we go through these projects, and as I mentioned earlier, just thinking through the stakeholder ecosystem as a whole, and how we're trying to build the whole shape. And, we're getting into payers here, but I think that's something that really happens when you're doing this. Because if you look at a lot of these different issues, I think it touches a lot more people at your company than maybe just thinking through the, the market access team. Annie, are you allowed or able to unmute yourself? I'll see if it lets me do it. Zoom hates me today. It should work now.
Hello.
There we go. It's magical.
Okay, great. So as Amanda mentioned, I'll transition into more of the real world implementation of a segmentation project. So what I hope you take away from this at the end of the day is that a segmentation is not a one and done, and it's not a one size fits all, right? So what we don't hope is that, clients come to us and say, okay, we want to do a segmentation project. We know that cluster 1 is high Medicaid. We know that cluster 2 is high product 2 prefers, right? And then that data just kind of sits there and nothing actionable happens from that. So my next couple of slides will be talking through how do you, across your organization in market access, in your HEOR, RWE teams, how do you tailor your strategy by that clustering information and to kind of optimize access within clusters and optimize outcomes, right? So everybody wants preferential formulary placement. Sometimes that's a little bit more of a lofty goal, especially with that cluster 1 that Parker showed us, where there was almost complete formulary uniformity, right? But how do you kind of use both the evidence you'll have from clinical trials, from initial pricing, along with the segmentation information and the clustering information, and then augmenting that with further real world data. And so these are some groups, but in the next slides, I'll talk through each cluster and really the next step strategies, right? And what you would need to be thinking through for each cluster from the perspective of access, from the perspective of real world data, and from the perspective of a payer approach strategy. So these 4 buckets give us some evidence types that may come out of real world data. So you've got budget impact modeling, cost effectiveness modeling, doing adherence studies, studying side effect burdens, those kinds of things, as well as your more regional and specific patient population information around social determinants of health and any regional differences, like Parker mentioned, if there's a particular state that we know has a really high burden of chronic disease versus another state covered by a specific payer. So if we could go to the next slide.
Before we hop to that slide, we had a really good question come in that I can kind of start off with and then kick it over to the team. The question was, how are you deriving the reasons or influences to formulary decision making, as those are typically not available? And that's a great question. So we use a lot of different ways to get at this. So we do a lot of market research, for example. So we will talk to different payers. We do a lot of kind of trend following. We ourselves ourselves. We have people on our team who've worked in the payer space. Beni's been at a PBM. We have a pharmacist that was at an industry for a while for a payer. So we kind of follow, what's going on that way. But I think a bit of that could definitely be influenced or captured through our research. Also, what we're seeing, like I said, in terms of industry and trends reports, kind of what we have in terms of our internal knowledge, and also working with our clients to really understand what's important to them or what they're seeing in their market. Obviously, our clients know their market better than anybody, right? So we do work with teams to kind of build out what the rationale is and what items they think are particularly important given their experiences. So I think it comes from a lot of different places. Parker, I don't know, Beni, if you guys have something to add to that too on where we get the information.
I think Parker has.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm raising my hand. But yeah, I think a really concrete example would be good. So I definitely agree with everything Amanda said about, doing that payer market research to inform some of the variables that we develop. Another thing you can do is try to find proxy variables, right? We can't get inside of every single payer decision maker's head, but we can see if there are any macro variables that are influencing or potentially creating trends in formulary decision making. I think a really good example of this is looking at payviders. Sometimes in these segmentations, the payviders just kind of spread out between the clusters because there's not a real strong formulary or other trend with the payviders. But sometimes, and actually I'd say oftentimes, the payviders kind of center into a single cluster. And what you'll oftentimes see if that happens is that there's a particular formulary preference or formulary bent. And a lot of times you'll see that there's high formulary uniformity with those providers. And now you can kind of connect the dots and look at the macro variables. If it's theoretically possible that a payvider has more of an ear to the doctors that are within that system that's offering that health plan, doctors might have different preferences and want more flexibility to prescribe certain products over another. And so within that formulary for that payer, there might be more formulary uniformity, and that could be the reason for that. Now, we're obviously just finding correlations between variables, and we're making strategic assumptions about what those mean. But that's where I think a clustering becomes very powerful, is we're not just looking at the formulary data on a 2x2 axis to see who prefers one product over another. We're seeing how formulary uniformity may be correlated with the organizational structure of a payer. I think that's where this clustering algorithm and doing this segmentation in a little bit of a different way than has been done before is really powerful for assessing those differences in that formulary decision making. Beni, I don't know if you have anything to add, but
I think that was perfect.
cool. Well, I'll turn it back over to you so you can kind of continue on.
Sure. So if you want to move to the next slide.
This slide or the slide after?
Slide after, please.
Great.
Okay, so now we'll get into talking through specific examples, looking at a cluster versus kind of what your strategy might be for that potential cluster, right? So for cluster one, as Parker mentioned, highly Medicaid population, right? High Medicaid percentage within this population of payers. So we also see the formulary uniformity, a decent amount of provider integration, and a decent amount of not-for-profit kind of in that mix. So how does that translate to your strategy? Well, one thing I want to touch on before we even get into the heat map is, that this is going to be a highly unique population because of the Medicaid percentage. So already you're looking at a population that is potentially niche-ish. So that should immediately make you think of, okay, what are the social determinants of health for this population? How do those differ from your commercial versus your Medicare markets? And is there a particular value proposition for our product, let's say product number 3, within this market? So looking at kind of moving into the heat map, we can see here, this looks to be some mostly regional payers. So we're looking at mostly regional, and we have a pretty high concentration in states that are known to have to not only be high risk, but also have high comorbidity burden, have very low access to healthcare, and have low socioeconomic status. So we're looking at the West Virginia, the Mississippi, the Kentucky, right? So those states, in terms of approaching cluster 1 payers, knowing that they're kind of concentrated within those states, you'll know that your value proposition to them is going to need to focus on improving access, right? And how do you handle a cluster where you know there's a large probability that care is being determined in one place, maybe at a large hospital, versus your access being determined within the community, right? And your strategy, both from a field perspective, from a market access perspective, from an RWE perspective, how do you marry across those fields and really ensure that the patients who need treatment are getting treatment, and the payers who are covering these patients are covering your product and marketing it to the patients that need it. So here, thinking through kind of your strategy for a new and novel product coming to market will be different from your strategy for a product that's been on market. So new and novel coming to market, you're really looking to optimize your clinical trial data and your initial pricing information. Here, since the cluster 1 has really high formulary uniformity, you're probably not going into this cluster with the argument that you should get preferential formulary placement, right? Because we know their formulary uniformity is really high, it's very likely that no matter what argument you make, if you get covered, you'll be covered along with other products within your market basket similarly. So here it's more of an argument of we want to be covered. We want to be placed on formulary with other products in our market basket. And then you're making the argument that your product would be beneficial to budget. So this cluster is likely going to prioritize immediate budget impact because of the not-for-profit, because of the high Medicaid percentage. You're probably not looking at payers that are going to be interested in taking a risk on a potential risk on a highly priced product that doesn't have the longitudinal clinical benefit, right? So your immediate first conversations with these payers is going to be focused on that budget impact and how do you demonstrate your value, particularly in the cost space for patients, for the payer, over and above products 1 and 2. So if your product's been on market for a while, then you would augment that with other real world data to demonstrate that cost benefit long term and even the clinical benefit long term to kind of make the argument that your product is performing well, it is worth the price tag, whatever that may be. And so you're looking at things like budget impact models, cost effectiveness models, definitely, like I mentioned, the social determinants of health data and analyses where you're really targeting the patients who have low access and figuring out, is there a play for your product within, let's say, you perform particularly well in patients who have high comorbidity burden, right? That's going to be very important for these payers because they're in states that have a high comorbidity burden. So optimizing your strategy for those. And then I think we can move to the next one. Okay, so for cluster 2, when I kind of see this radar chart, it immediately pings in my mind, I think, like, okay, what's the rebate structure here? Because there's very low formulary uniformity, low Medicaid percentage, some Medicare, very low not-for-profit, and that very, very strong product number 2 preference, right? So why is product number 2 being preferred to that extent across these payers? So in my mind, I immediately think of rebates as coming from a PBM. So when I think of rebates, I think of, okay, your strategy for approaching these payers is probably going to, again, if you're new and novel, you're optimizing clinical trial and initial pricing data, but here you're wanting to understand, okay, what is the what's the value proposition for a cluster that is such a strong preferer of a competitor product? So in your initial conversations, you're probably not going to immediately replace product number 2 for these payers, right? Because they have such a strong preference for it. However, I think your initial conversations are, let's get coverage, let's prove benefit. And when you're putting together your evidence package, you're really looking at the overall product value here, right? So it's going to be less focused on cost, although cost will still be definitely a component of how you're showing value. But you're looking at your clinical superiority, so efficacy and safety data, the total cost of care. If there's a play to align your metrics for your product with these payers' quality metrics and value-based care initiatives, that would be really strong evidence for them to start preferring your product. So here, thinking through things like adherence to clinical guidelines. So we've got an adherence rate example on the right, showing 3 products, and an analysis was done on adherence in the overall population versus commercial Medicare and Medicaid, and was found to be significant overall and also in Medicare. And given that cluster 2 has a really high Medicare percentage, that could be forgot the word I was thinking of. That could be put into a value proposition for these payers to really incentivize them to think, oh, maybe we do want to prefer product number 3. Thinking through other outcomes, real world data outcomes you could implement, readmission rates, mortality rates, complication rates, and any disparities in care. So again, looking kind of at the heat map here, the mix seems to be pretty like national plus probably some regional. So here you're focusing more on your overall product value for this market, and then if there are any segments within the segment, to kind of give you the idea, like your strategy for California is probably going to be very different from your strategy for Illinois, right? So kind of thinking through those things, both across clusters and within clusters. And then if you can go to the next slide. Perfect. So for cluster number 3, which I think this is the first time we're seeing it, but this is another cluster in that same analysis. And here we're looking at a really strong product number 1 preference. Given the low Medicare and Medicaid percentages of the population, this is probably a highly commercial payer mix. With that product number one preference, like I said, these payers are going to be more likely to take on that short-term financial risk for a long-term benefit. So that long-term benefit being either clinical or cost or a combination of the two. So your initial conversations, again, focusing on coverage because of that very strong product number one preference, you're probably not going to immediately dethrone product number one. So it's more about how do you get in and then prove better and eventually kind of dethrone that product number one. Here, because we're in a very highly commercial population, and based on the heat map, you can see it's pretty national. There are definitely hot spots, kind of in a band across the middle of the US, but pretty national. So you're probably looking at more of your quality of life measures. And we have an example here of some quality of life analysis by product and kind of showing that value to the patients that the payers are providing care to. And so quality of life, patient satisfaction, your symptom control, daily functioning, these are patients who are going to need to be at work every day. And we want them to be able to go to work and not have such a high disease burden that they're missing a lot of work. So even maybe bringing in some impact on work productivity analyses, those sorts of things might help boost up that value prop. And then I think that's it for me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Benny. And, one thing I'll say just to kind of wrap all of this up, and what I think is really interesting is we're sometimes the benefit of these segmentations is we're able to kind of see which clusters we should prioritize over another in terms of pre-launch. But in this case, even when you're in post-launch, there might be certain clusters that you're like, man, we cannot dethrone product number one here for cluster 3, no matter how hard we try, or just not getting through. And these are the opportunities, I think, in this real world implementation. It's not just about the strategy and saying, okay, who do we avoid or who do we not? It's also saying, okay, now that we have more resources, or as we've kind of gone later into the product life cycle, how do we, on the margins, create small wins in some of these clusters that can be beneficial and valuable to our product portfolio? And I think that's where this real world implementation becomes very interesting. This may not seem like a cluster that you could potentially make inroads into, but as you think through and look at the cluster and look at the specific characteristics of that cluster, we're able to kind of see and parse out how could we potentially just turn a few more payers in this cluster over to product 3, or how do we even just get a little bit more coverage? Maybe it's just being placed on a non-preferred tier at this point. How do we do that? How do we increase that access? Though these are kind of I think where the real magic happens in terms of that real world implementation. How do we win on the margins? How do we kind of slowly move this market towards being more preferential for our product in terms of access? So yeah, I think that, we've got about 13 minutes left. So I don't know if we have any other questions for Beni and I or Amanda. But we're very much happy to answer any questions that you guys have at this point.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll open up the floor for any questions from our participants. One of the things I think is interesting, Medicaid is particularly poking out at me as an area where segmentation is really important right now. I think between state PDABs, the pricing drug affordability boards and all of the different, or prescription drug affordability boards and all of the different things going on there. I think we're going to have some pretty interesting things going on at the state level. So it's not just looking at like what the payer is doing in terms of driving access and coverage, but also like how the state and their behavior is affecting that too. So I think that's a really intriguing area that's going to change a lot over the next few years. So I'm going to see if we have any other questions. I think we are all good. So thank you all so much for joining us. Just so you know, our next month, our last one of the year, will be navigating social determinants of health to improve patient access. So this is something that we have talked a lot about, is actually using SCOH data and thinking about that in your patient assistance strategy. There's a lot of things that can be done that I think people are a little shy or a little nervous to do at companies, but we've got some ideas around how that can evolve. And we look forward to having you all join. Thank you so much. Sorry for my complications with traveling, but we appreciate you hanging out with us. And thank you so much to Beni and Parker. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.